Hello, we are Group 3B, and then we are presenting on threats and attacks. Um, so, after this presentation, you should have knowledge about threats, um, know the various forms of threats, you should know about attacks, and then you get to know about the various forms of attacks. Okay, so let's move on. Now, we say that a threat is a potential negative action or event facilitated by a vulnerability that results in an unwanted impact to a computer system or application. Now, one thing that we should realize that threats actually in a computer world, threats actually happens a lot of times. Mostly, it could be a threat to an organization, it could be a threat to a company, it could be a threat to an individual. So, threat actually happens a lot in the computer setting. And then we are saying a threat could actually be an object, or maybe a person, or maybe an entity that represents, let's say, a constant danger to an asset. So, um, threats can come in the form of maybe an individual, maybe an object, or maybe an entity that poses danger to the organization, to the organization, or to the organization's assets. Um, I think there was a survey that was actually conducted in 2014 by the CSI, the Computer Security Institute, and then the FBI. And they actually found that about 79% of organizations reported cybersecurity breaches within the last 12 months. And then 54% of those organizations reported financial losses totaling over around $141 million. And then you can actually imagine that you can actually realize that threat actually happens a lot. And then based on this survey, threat happens to a lot in the computer setting. Okay, so um, vulnerability is a weakness or fault that can lead to exposure, and then a threat agent is used to indicate an individual or group that can manifest a threat. Now let's come to the threat agent that we just talked about. The threat agent can take one or more forms of the foreign actions against an asset. So the threat agent, like we said, could be an entity, it could be a person, it could be an object. We are saying that for threat agent, these are the actions they can actually perform. They can perform unauthorized access. Um, if someone outside the organization or maybe someone within an organization accesses a file that they are not supposed to access, that is a threat action. And then misuse of data. So unauthorized use of assets, example, identity theft, setting up a pawn distribution service on a compromised server, etc. So and then it could also for in an organization, you are giving access to files, and then um, you use them, um, what we use files that you are not authorized to use. So that's and then disclose. We have the threat agent illicitly discloses sensitive information. So we've heard about whistleblowers who disclose information within the. Sometimes there could be potential whistleblowers within or an organization. It could be an employee within the organization who would disclose information that they are not supposed to disclose. Most of the time, they would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then some employees go to that extent of disclosing information, and they breach that agreement. And it's no, when you're actually caught, it's comes with a lot of penalties. Okay, so and then the next one is modification. You modify unauthorized. You make changes to unauthorized assets. or yeah, you perform actions that you are not supposed to perform on some assets, and then deny access. So deny access includes distraction, theft of another data asset, etc. And we have the types of threats. So threat can take one or more of the following actions forms. So we have the human threat. With the human threat, maybe um, an individual or an organization taking uh, another person's intellectual property or a physical property. That could be a human threat. And then we have electronic or software threat. We have the use of software or electronic means of illegally access or cause damage to assets. And then we have the technical threats. So in in the software setting, we have this technical threat a lot. Mostly, it could actually come in the form, especially when you're working in distributed systems. There are possible hardware failures that actually come. There are possible hardware failures that actually happens. It could be that you are using an outdated technology. You have to keep up with the changing technology. It could be power failure. These are all technical threats that could happen to an organization. Then the last one, we have the forces of nature. Could be like weather conditions, natural disaster, and then the uh, and then when we start with the human threats, we are saying that the human threats include but not limited to acts of human error or failure. So human threats could come in the form of uh, accidents or maybe mistakes made by an employee. And then we have the intellectual property compromise, like piracy, copyright infringement, and all. Then deliberate espionage or trespass. That's unauthorized access, unauthorized access, and then data collection. And then deliberate information extortion, like blackmail of info disclosure. And then deliberate sabotage or vandalism. We have destruction of system or information, and then it could also come in the form of deliberate act of theft, like illegally taking equipment or information. Now, for the human error, the the human error actually includes things like inexperience, improper training, and then incorrect assumptions. So sometimes when you join an organization, when as a new employee you are given training, you are trained on. First of all, you sign agreements. You are supposed to sign some non-disclosure agreement. Where you have to uh, keep private all make sure that all company information or document that you access are private within the organization. You don't expose them to people outside the organization, and then even people within the organization who do not have who are not supposed to, who are not authorized to have access to the data. And inexperience. So if you are giving a company tool or a company document, and then an employee who is not in a who is not who does not have the enough experience to work with that, um, it's actually could result to threats. And then we have the improper training. So if the employee is not given a proper training on how to manage the data, how to um, make sure how to manipulate data within the organization, they could pose threats. And then we have incorrect assumptions. So employees are among the greatest threats to organizations' data. Now, the employee's mistake can easily lead to a revelation of classified data, entry of erroneous data, accidental data deletion or modification, and then data storage in unprotected areas, and then failure to protect information. And then these employees could also be an insider threat. So for insider threats, sometimes we have, like just like I said, we have whistleblowers. Sometimes we do have whistleblowers within the company who um, disclose confidential and then classified information to the to people outside the organization, mostly to the media. For instance, we heard about um, Edward Snowden, who is a whistleblower. He actually worked at the NSA. He revealed classified information to the media about data collection that's happening at the NSA. The government's actually collecting data and then um, taking control over people's data and then tracking people. Okay, so the inside action, just like I said, can happen when someone close to an organization with authorized access misuses that access to negatively impact the organization's critical information or systems. Uh, so, software threats. Now we've talked about the normal threat. Now we come back to the software threats as in our setting, and then we're saying that malicious software damages, destroys, or denies services to target systems. So mostly we for software threats, mostly we have viruses, we have denial of services, we have worms, Trojan horses, and logic bombs, and then backdoors. Like, viruses are actually common. Yeah, viruses are actually common, and then denial of services is mostly common among distributed systems. What we call DDoSing. Okay, so with viruses, um, and then we have when self-propagating malware over networks, and then we have Trojan horses. So mostly Trojan horses are not actually viruses, but they contain viruses. And we have logic bombs, so malicious code placed in software triggered by an attacker. So this then mostly could happen in open source softwares where the software, if the software is not, if proper uh, software practices are not put in place uh, to ensure that everyone follows the rules and all that. Mostly, I think recently one I've forgotten the university, but one professor was actually conducting research on open source softwares, and then they were trying to create PRs, pull requests with they just created pull requests with some malicious codes in there, and then they actually they were successful because those PRs were made, and later on they actually found out. So there's an example of a logic bomb, and then we have the backdoors, but mostly as a software developer, sometimes you actually include a backdoor in a system that you create to make sure that in case there is any failure, you will be able to have access to the system and then fix that issue. But sometimes when hackers get are able to make it so that if they're able to identify the backdoors, they would actually uh, take control over the system. And then we have the denial of service attack, where the attackers tracking flags taking down internet services. Okay, so we have let's come to the forces of nature. The forces of nature. So nature is among the most dangerous threats to information security. Then they are very dangerous since they are unexpected and could come with little warning. And then they disrupt lives of individuals but also cause damage to information stored within computers. And then they can be avoided with precautionary measures. Definitely, will come to the precautionary measures. Okay, so let's see the technical threats. The technical threats could be an internet service failure, could be a software failure, could be a hardware failure, and it could be power outages. Okay, so let's come to attacks. Attacks. So an attack is an act or action that exploits vulnerability in controlled system, accompanied by a threat agent, which damages or steals organization's information. Then a botnet is a network of devices that has been infected with malicious software such as a virus. So mostly we have network devices that are actually uh, infected by viruses, and then these network devices are what we call a botnet. Then a device affected by a virus or hacked is known as a zombie. Okay, so we the different types of attacks are one is the first one is the malware. We have the fission attacks. We have the man in the middle attack, and then the denial of service attack. So we take them one by one and then explain them. And then we have the SQL injection, which actually happens in web development, web applications. And then we have the zero-day exploit, and then DNS tunneling. So let's start with the malware. The malware is a term used to describe malicious software, including spyware, ransomware, viruses, and worms. So malware breaches a network through a vulnerability, typically when a user clicks a dangerous link or email attachment that then installs risky software. So the term malware actually is a broad term. The term malware is actually a broad term, and then it actually includes spywares. Um, ha- Spywares are actually softwares that uh, I use to spy the users or the user on the computer. Mostly they are mostly hidden processes. And then we have the ransomware. You have the ransomware where the attacker uses that to take control by a system, and then mostly they require you to pay a ransom before um, you be given access back to your system. You be given back access to your system. And then we have the viruses which affect the computer, and then we have worms. So malware breaches a network through a vulnerability. Typically, when a user clicks a dangerous link or email attachment, that then installs risky software. Mostly when you are installing free softwares like patched softwares, mostly when you're installing these types of software, sometimes they actually include um, this type of malware. It could actually be a spyware. I had a friend who recently had his system attacked. He tried installing a patched software, a cracked software, and then it just took over the system. And then it only displayed a message saying that he's supposed to pay an amount before he'll be given back access. So mostly it could come in the form of a software. It could come bundled in a software, or it could be an email attachment. Sometimes when you receive an email, you'll be sent a link, and then you just click on the link. You'll be sent to a site, and then you could be sent to a site where uh, your personal information can be taken. So you have to take note of that. Sometimes that's why mostly when it comes to software, executable softwares, mostly you have to make sure that you are installing from a verified publisher. You make sure that it's actually verified. It's verified and signed by the publisher, by a verified publisher, before you actually install the software, because it could actually, if not, it can actually contain uh, a malware which you might not be aware of. Okay. So once the attacker is inside the system, or once the malware is inside the system, these are the things that it can do. It can actually block access to key components of the network, and then it can install malwares and or additional harmful softwares, and then covertly obtains information by transmitting data from the hard drive. So with the spyware, they can actually obtain your personal information. They just spy on the user. They just transfer. They actually gain access to your computer hard drive, and then they transfer valuable information from your hard drive. They copy the data, and then a malware can also disrupt certain components and render the system inoperable. So they can actually stop most processes on the system. That just like what they can just stop most processes. The system will not be able to run. And then we have several softwares that are actually malwares. Even the cell browser is a malware. In a way, act as a malware. They said because it blocks some key uh, components of the cell. It actually blocks the usual functioning of the computer. So it's somehow act as a malware in some cases. Okay. Now, phishing. So, phishing is the process of sending fraudulent communication that appear to come from a reputable source, usually through email. Phishing, basically, phishing mostly happens through email. Sometimes you just receive an email, and then they'll be like, you have received this amount of money, then just try contacting them back. And then this is an example of phishing. So when you follow, then you be they'll just fraud you. And then the, the goal is to steal sensitive data like credit card, login information, or to install malware on a victim's machine. Phishing is an increasingly common cyber. It's actually the most common cyber threat. It's actually the most common cyber threat. It happens a lot. Most of the time, you receive a lot of spams. A lot of spam emails requesting for some information. Um, they'll just be like, you have received this from the UN. They behave as if they actually try to represent a particular organization, which is actually not true. And we have the man in the middle attack. So the man in the middle attack, also known as eavesdropping attacks, occur when attackers insert themselves into a two-party transaction. Once the attackers interrupt the traffic, they can filter and steal information. With the man in the middle, with the man in the middle attack, mostly it happens on Wi-Fi networks. So with the attacker actually so the attacker which actually they actually act as middleways between the two connected parties. So mostly if the if if the system has weak encryption, they're able to decrypt and then come in between the connection. There are two common points of entry for man-in-the-middle attacks. Just like I said, Wi-Fi networks, well, mostly with weak encryptions or mostly unsecure public network. Sometimes you connect to. It's very dangerous to connect to free public Wi-Fi's. Sometimes they are just opened by when an attacker wants to attack you. Sometimes they just open a free Wi-Fi, and then when you connect, they're able to gain access to your machine. Yeah. And without knowing, the visitor passes all information to the attacker. It's mostly when since you are connected to the Wi-Fi, they're able to uh, they're actually acting as middlewares. So it's like when you are passing information, you're actually passing it through the attacker's network straight. They have access to they have copies of the information that you are passing. And then once the malware has breached a device, an attacker can install software to process all of the victim's information. Okay, and then we have the denial of service attack. The denial of service attack floods systems, servers, networks with traffic to exhaust resources and value. As a result, the system is unable to fulfill legitimate requests. Attackers can also use multiple compromised devices to launch this attack, and this is known as the distributed denial of service attack. Now, in distributed systems, this happens a lot in distributed systems. With the DDoSing attacks happens a lot on distributed systems where they actually communicating with each other. And then we have the SQL injection. SQL injection nowadays is not really common because unlike initially where most I think most programming languages were not by default protecting against SQL injection, and the developer will have to take care of that. And then for most beginner developers, they don't really consider uh, SQL injections. Then they just try to insert the data directly without um, serializing the data. So with the SQL injection occurs when an attacker inserts malicious code into a server that uses SQL and forces the server to reveal information it normally would not. And then mostly it happens in, for instance, if you have a form, the attacker can actually just include, let's say, a backslash, and then when that information is not serialized and then it's inserted directly, it is inserted directly, it can actually reveal the table structure that the attacker can see the table structure. They can see information that's they can perform select queries. They can actually perform some queries within the data. And then we have the zero-day exploit. The zero-day exploit hits after a network vulnerability is announced, but before a patch or solution is implemented. Attackers target the disclosed vulnerability during this window of time. A zero-day vulnerability threat detection requires constant awareness. And then we have the DNS standalone. The DNS standalone utilizes the DNS protocol to communicate non-DNS traffic over port 53. It sends HTTP and other protocol traffic over DNS. And there are um, various legitimate reasons to utilize the DNS standalone. However, there are also malicious reasons to use DNS standalone VPN services, and they can be used to disguise outbound traffic as DNS, concealing data that is typically shared through an internet connection. And then for malicious use, the DNS requests are manipulated to exfiltrate data from a compromised system to the attacker's infrastructure. It can also be used for command and control callbacks from the attacker's infrastructure to a compromised system. So this is the end of our presentation. We talked about uh, threats, and then we said that threats could come in the form of human. Threats could come in the form of it could be an object or an entity or maybe a person that poses uh, danger on an organization's assets. And then we said that the threats could come in the form of human error. Then we talked about attacks.